When Amelia steps off the stagecoach in 1867 Nebraska Territory, she discovers the thriving town and respectable husband she was promised exist only in a cruel joke, leaving her stranded at an abandoned railway station with $3 and nowhere to go. A struggling rancher named Daniel offers her shelter out of kindness, but as their partnership deepens into something neither expected, dangerous men from her past arrive to collect what they believe they're owed. Will Amelia fight for the love she's found? Or will the men who orchestrated her deception destroy the only home she's ever truly chosen? The stagecoach wheels screamed against the brakes as dust exploded around Amelia like a brown cloud of broken promises. She pressed her face to the window, expecting to see the bustling town of Millbrook with its painted storefronts and busy streets that Benjamin Fletcher had described in his letters. Instead, her heart dropped into her stomach like a stone thrown into a deep well. Broken windows stared back at her like dead eyes. Weeds grew through the wooden sidewalks where ladies in fine dresses should have been shopping. The only movement came from a rusty sign that creaked back and forth in the October wind, hanging by a single nail from what used to be the general store. "End of the line, miss," called the driver, his voice rough as sandpaper. He jumped down from his high seat and wiped his hands on his dusty coat. "This here's Bitter Creek Station, Nebraska Territory. Year of our Lord, 1867, and ain't much to look at, I'll grant you that." Amelia's hands shook as she climbed down from the coach. Her blue dress, the nicest one she owned, was already wrinkled from 2 days of travel. She had sewn new ribbons on it just for this day, the day she was supposed to meet her future husband. The ribbons felt foolish now, like putting flowers on a grave. "Sir, there must be some mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm supposed to meet Mr. Benjamin Fletcher. He owns a farm here. He sent me this letter." She pulled the worn paper from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. She had read it so many times that the creases were soft as cloth. The driver scratched his gray beard and squinted at the empty buildings. "Well, I'll be. Lady, I've been driving this route for near on 15 years. Ain't no farms around here worth mentioning, and I never heard tell of no Benjamin Fletcher." He hefted her heavy trunk down from the coach with a grunt. "But I got my orders. Paper says Bitter Creek Station, and that's where you are." Amelia's throat felt tight, like someone was squeezing it with invisible hands. She looked at the letter again, hoping the words would somehow change. But there it was, written in neat handwriting. "My dearest Amelia, I await your arrival at Bitter Creek Station with the greatest anticipation. You will find me a man of good character and comfortable means, eager to provide you with the home you deserve." "How much to take me back to Lincoln?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. $5, miss, and I'm heading the other direction anyhow. Won't be back this way for 2 weeks." The driver climbed back onto his seat, clearly eager to leave this ghost town behind. Amelia opened her small purse and counted her coins. $3.47. Everything she owned in the world, except for the trunk that held her few dresses and her mother's Bible. Back in Boston, she had sold everything else to pay for the train ticket west and the stagecoach fare. "Wait!" she called out, but the driver was already slapping the reins. The horses snorted and pulled away, leaving her standing alone in a cloud of dust that settled on her shoulders like shame. The silence hit her like a physical blow. No voices, no wagon wheels, no sounds of life anywhere. Just the wind whistling through the gaps in the broken buildings and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She had traveled over 1,000 miles to find herself more alone than she had ever been in her life. Amelia sat down on her trunk, fighting back tears that would do her no good. She thought about her sister Margaret, safe in her fine house in Boston with her banker husband. Margaret had laughed when Amelia announced her plans to marry a stranger out west. "You'll be sorry," she had said. "Mark my words, Amelia, you'll be sorry." The sun was getting lower in the sky, painting the empty town in shades of orange and gold that might have been beautiful if her heart wasn't breaking. She had to think, had to make a plan. But all she could think about was the factory job she had quit, the tiny room she had given up, the bridges she had burned to come to this place that didn't want her. A sound made her look up, hoofbeats coming closer. Her heart jumped with hope. Maybe it was Benjamin Fletcher, coming to explain the mistake. Maybe there was a perfectly good reason why she had been sent to this abandoned place. But the man who rode into view was not the gentleman farmer she had imagined. He was tall and lean, with work-roughened hands and clothes that had seen better days. His horse was a practical brown mare, not the fine stallion she had pictured. When he saw her sitting on her trunk, he pulled up short, his eyes widening with surprise. "Miss?" he called out, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised her. "Are you all right?" The stranger dismounted from his horse with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. Up close, Amelia could see that his clothes were clean, but patched, and his boots were worn thin at the heels. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. They were the color of the sky just before sunset, gray-blue and steady. I'm looking for someone," Amelia said, standing up and brushing the dust from her skirt. She tried to sound confident, but her voice came out small and uncertain. "Mr. Benjamin Fletcher, do you know him?" The man's face changed, and Amelia saw something flash in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or recognition. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "I know of him," he said finally. "But miss, I'm afraid he doesn't live anywhere near here." "Benjamin Fletcher is." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He's the son of a rich cattle rancher down in Lincoln. Spends most of his time in saloons and gambling halls." Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. "But his letters, he said he had a farm." "He said he was looking for a wife to help him build a life together." She pulled out the letter again, holding it out to him like proof. The man stepped closer, and she caught the scent of leather and honest work. He read the letter, his jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, he looked up at her with something that might have been pity. "Miss, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Benjamin Fletcher is known for his practical jokes, especially ones played on ladies who answer matrimonial advertisements." His voice was gentle, but the words hit her like physical blows. "He's done this before. Sends women to places like this, then tells his friends about it for entertainment." The letter fell from Amelia's numb fingers. The wind caught it and blew it away, tumbling it across the dusty street like a piece of trash. She watched it go, feeling something inside her break apart. "A joke," she whispered. "I'm a joke." "No," the man said firmly. "You're not a joke. You're a victim of a cruel man's idea of fun." He bent down and picked up his hat, which had fallen when he dismounted. "I'm Daniel McKinnon. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's real." Amelia looked at him through eyes that felt scratchy with unshed tears. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you look like you need someone to tell you the truth." Daniel's voice was steady, matter of fact. "And because I've been where you are. Maybe not exactly, but close enough." "Where I am?" Amelia laughed, but it came out bitter and broken. "Where I am is stranded in a ghost town with $3 to my name and nowhere to go. I doubt you've ever been quite that foolish." Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her face. 3 years ago, I lost everything I had. My wife died, and I couldn't pay the debts on my father's old ranch. Had to start over with nothing but the clothes on my back and a stubborn refusal to quit." He gestured toward the empty buildings around them. "I know what it feels like to have your whole world fall apart in one day." Something in his voice made Amelia look at him more carefully. She saw the lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders that spoke of carrying heavy burdens. This wasn't a man who had lived an easy life. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. "Thank you. My point is, I know what it's like to need help and be too proud to ask for it." Daniel looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "It'll be dark soon, and it gets cold out here at night. You're welcome to stay at my place until you figure out what you want to do next." Amelia stared at him. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." "Could be," Daniel agreed. "But you're not. You're a lady who got dealt a bad hand through no fault of her own. And I'm a man who believes in helping people when I can." He paused, seeming to consider his next words. "I have a sister who visits once a month. She can vouch for my character if you're worried about propriety." "I can't pay you," Amelia said quietly. "Didn't ask you to. Though I admit I could use help around the place. Cooking, mending, that sort of thing. If you're willing." Daniel's tone was casual, but Amelia heard the careful respect in it. He was offering her a way to keep her dignity. Amelia looked around at the empty town, then up at the darkening sky. She thought about her choices, which seemed to be very few. She could sit here and wait for the next stagecoach in 2 weeks, assuming she could survive that long. She could try to walk to Lincoln, though she had no idea how far it was or if she could make it alone. Or she could trust this stranger who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than she had received in months. "Just until I can make other arrangements," she said finally. Daniel nodded, as if he had expected nothing more. "I'll help you with your trunk." Together, they lifted the heavy case onto the back of his horse. Amelia walked beside the mare as Daniel led them away from Bitter Creek Station, away from the ghost town that had been the end of one dream and, perhaps, the beginning of something she couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the empty buildings faded into the darkness, holding their secrets and their silence. But ahead, a warm light glowed in the distance, promising shelter and safety and maybe, just maybe, a chance to start over. The rooster's crow shattered Amelia's sleep like glass breaking against stone. She bolted upright in the narrow bed, her heart hammering as sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then it all came rushing back. The empty town, the cruel joke, Daniel McKinnon's unexpected kindness. She was in his spare room, surrounded by simple wooden furniture and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen below. Amelia dressed quickly in her brown work dress, the one she had worn in the factory back in Boston. As she made her way downstairs, she heard Daniel moving around outside, talking softly to his animals. Through the window, she could see him feeding 3 horses in a small corral. His movements were efficient and gentle, the actions of a man who cared for his creatures. The kitchen was larger than she had expected, with a big stone fireplace and shelves lined with mismatched dishes. A pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, and beside it lay a piece of paper with her name written on it in careful handwriting. "Miss Hartwell," the note read, "help yourself to coffee and whatever you can find for breakfast. I'll be back from the south pasture around noon. There's no hurry about anything. Take your time getting settled. D. McKinnon." Amelia folded the note and put it in her pocket. No man had ever left her such a message before. No orders, no expectations, just simple courtesy. She found eggs in a basket by the door and bacon hanging in the cool pantry. As she cooked, she studied the kitchen more carefully. Everything was clean but showed signs of a man living alone. The dishes were stacked haphazardly. Dust gathered in the corners. The curtains were faded and torn in places. It wasn't neglect, exactly, but rather the result of someone who took care of necessities without thinking about comfort. After breakfast, Amelia explored the rest of the cabin. The main room held a stone fireplace, 2 chairs, and a table that looked like Daniel had built it himself. Books lined a shelf on one wall, mostly about farming and animal care, but she spotted a volume of poetry that surprised her. A man who read poetry was not what she had expected. Outside, the ranch spread before her like a promise written in grass and sky. The cabin sat on a small rise, giving her a view of rolling hills dotted with cattle. A vegetable garden behind the house had been planted but clearly needed attention. Weeds choked the potato plants, and the tomatoes hung heavy and unpicked. Amelia rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The sun climbed higher as she pulled weeds and harvested vegetables. Her hands, soft from months of indoor work, began to blister. But there was something satisfying about the physical labor, something that quieted the worried voices in her head. She was hanging laundry on a rope line between 2 trees when she heard horses approaching. Her stomach clenched with fear. What if it was Benjamin Fletcher's friends, come to continue their cruel game? But when she looked up, she saw Daniel riding toward the house with another man beside him. The second rider was older, with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money. He sat his horse like a man who was used to being in charge. When he saw Amelia, his eyes narrowed with interest that made her skin crawl. "Daniel, my boy," the older man called out as they dismounted. You didn't mention you had company. Daniel's jaw was tight as he tied his horse to the fence post. Miss Hartwell is my guest, Mr. Caldwell. She's staying here temporarily. Harrison Caldwell removed his hat with exaggerated politeness. Harrison Caldwell at your service, miss. I own the largest ranch in 3 counties. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. And you must be the famous mail-order bride we've been hearing about. Amelia's blood turned to ice water. Word had already spread about her humiliation. She lifted her chin and met Caldwell's stare directly. I'm Amelia Hartwell. I'm helping Mr. McKinnon with his household while I make plans for my future. How practical, Caldwell said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. Though I wonder what kind of future a woman in your situation can really expect. Out here, options are rather limited for someone without family or resources. Daniel stepped between them, his voice carrying a warning. Miss Hartwell's situation is her own business, Caldwell. What brings you out this way? Caldwell's attention shifted back to Daniel, but Amelia felt his interest in her like a physical weight. I came to discuss that piece of land by Miller's Creek. The offer still stands if you change your mind about selling. I won't, Daniel said flatly. Times are hard, my boy. Pride doesn't pay bills. Caldwell's gaze drifted back to Amelia. Though I see you found other ways to manage your expenses. The insult hit Amelia like a slap. She saw Daniel's hands clench into fists, and she quickly stepped forward before he could do something they'd both regret. Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm here as Mr. McKinnon's guest, nothing more. If you have business with him, perhaps you should conduct it without making assumptions about people you don't know. Caldwell's eyebrows rose in surprise. Clearly, he hadn't expected her to speak up for herself. My apologies if I offended, miss. I simply find it interesting that a woman of your circumstances has landed in such a fortunate situation. There's nothing fortunate about being the victim of a cruel prank, Amelia replied. But there is something fortunate about meeting people with actual decency. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Finally, Caldwell put his hat back on and mounted his horse. Think about my offer, McKinnon. Winter's coming, and things have a way of getting harder when you're trying to manage more than you can handle. He rode away without another word, but his meaning was clear. Amelia represented a problem, and problems had ways of attracting unwanted attention. 3 weeks had passed since Caldwell's visit, and Amelia had fallen into a rhythm that surprised her with its contentment. She woke each morning to the sound of Daniel starting his chores, made breakfast while he tended the animals, and spent her days bringing order to the neglected corners of his life. The garden now produced more vegetables than 2 people could eat. She had mended every piece of clothing Daniel owned, organized his scattered books, and scrubbed the cabin until it gleamed. In the evenings, they sat by the fireplace, Daniel reading aloud from his books while Amelia worked on sewing projects. But today felt different. Daniel had been quiet at breakfast, glancing toward the road as if expecting unwelcome visitors. When Amelia asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said he was probably imagining things. She was churning butter on the front porch when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A rider was approaching fast, pushing his horse harder than was wise in the afternoon heat. As the figure got closer, Amelia recognized Tom Bradley, who delivered mail and supplies to the scattered ranches in the area. Daniel, Tom called out as he pulled up to the house. You need to see this. Daniel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. What's got you so worked up, Tom? Tom dismounted and pulled a folded newspaper from his saddlebag. News from Lincoln, about Benjamin Fletcher. Amelia's hands stilled on the butter churn. At the mention of that name, all the peace she had found over the past weeks seemed to drain away. What about him? Daniel asked, taking the paper. He's dead, Tom said bluntly. Shot in a poker game 3 nights ago. But before he died, he was talking, bragging about his jokes on mail-order brides. Told his friends all about Miss Hartwell here. Amelia felt the world tilt sideways. She gripped the handle of the butter churn to steady herself. What did he tell them? Tom looked uncomfortable. Enough that they're placing bets. Some of Fletcher's rich friends think it's funny to keep the joke going. They're planning to come out here, see the desperate spinster for themselves. Daniel's face went dark as a thundercloud. What kind of bets? The kind that don't end well for decent folks? Tom replied. Word is, they're offering money to anyone who can. Well, let's just say, they don't have honorable intentions. Amelia stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak. She had thought the worst was behind her, that she had found a safe place to rebuild her life. But Fletcher's cruelty was reaching out from beyond the grave to destroy what little peace she had managed to create. How long do we have? Daniel asked. Could be days, could be weeks, but they're coming. Tom remounted his horse. Thought you should know. Miss Hartwell might want to consider moving on before they get here. After Tom rode away, Amelia and Daniel stood in heavy silence. The afternoon sun felt too bright, the peaceful ranch suddenly seeming exposed and vulnerable. I should leave, Amelia said quietly. I've brought you nothing but trouble. No. Daniel's response was immediate and firm. You've brought me. He paused, searching for words. You've brought me back to life, Amelia. This place was just a place before you came. Now it's a home. Amelia looked at him in surprise. In all their weeks together, he had never spoken so directly about his feelings. Daniel, I can't ask you to risk everything for me. These men have money and influence. They could ruin you. Let them try. Daniel's jaw was set with determination. I've lost everything once before. I survived it. But I won't survive watching you walk away because I was too much of a coward to fight for what matters. What matters? Amelia asked, though she thought she might know the answer. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes holding hers. You matter. What we've built here matters. The way you hum while you work, the way you've made this house feel alive again, the way you stand up to bullies like Caldwell, it all matters more than anything I've ever had. Amelia felt tears stinging her eyes. Daniel, I care about you too, more than I thought possible. But caring about someone doesn't mean putting them in danger. Then what do you suggest we do? Daniel asked. Because I'm not letting you face this alone. Before Amelia could answer, the sound of multiple horses reached them from the road. They turned to see a group of riders approaching 3 men in expensive clothes, riding horses that cost more than most people made in a year. Too late, Amelia whispered. They're here. Daniel moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Whatever happens, we face it together. The riders came closer, their laughter carrying on the wind like the sound of wolves circling prey. Amelia recognized the leader from Tom's description, James Morrison, Benjamin Fletcher's closest friend and the richest man in Lincoln County. As they dismounted in front of the cabin, Morrison's eyes fixed on Amelia with the cold calculation of a man who saw people as objects to be used. Well, he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. The famous Miss Hartwell. You're prettier than Fletcher described. Amelia felt Daniel tense beside her, ready to spring into action. But she knew that violence would only make things worse. These men had come expecting to find a helpless woman they could intimidate and humiliate. Instead, they would find someone who had learned to fight back with something more powerful than fists. The confrontation she had been dreading was finally here, and everything she had built with Daniel hung in the balance. James Morrison's polished boots hit the dusty ground with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. His 2 companions flanked him like hunting dogs, their eyes scanning the modest ranch with barely concealed amusement. The afternoon sun glinted off Morrison's gold watch chain as he adjusted his expensive jacket and smiled at Amelia with teeth that reminded her of a wolf. Miss Hartwell, Morrison said, removing his hat with mock courtesy. What a pleasure to finally meet Benjamin's little joke in person. Though I must say, you've landed quite nicely for someone who was supposed to be left high and dry. Amelia felt her spine straighten like a steel rod. She had spent weeks learning to stand tall in this harsh land, and she wasn't about to crumble now. Mr. Morrison, I presume, your reputation precedes you, though not in ways you might hope. Morrison's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He had clearly expected to find a broken woman, grateful for any scrap of attention. Instead, he found someone who looked him straight in the eye without flinching. Feisty, he chuckled, turning to his companions. Fletcher always did like them with some fight left in them. His gaze swept over the neat garden, the mended fence, the general air of prosperity that Amelia's hard work had brought to the place. Though it seems our little mail-order bride has found herself a comfortable arrangement here. Daniel stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down wolves and lived to tell about it. Miss Hartwell is a guest in my home. She's under my protection. Protection? Morrison laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. From what? We're here to help the poor dear. Benjamin may have played a cruel trick, but we're prepared to make it right. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. $500, Miss Hartwell. More money than you've probably seen in your entire life. All you have to do is come with us to Lincoln. Amelia stared at the envelope, her mind racing. $500 was more than she could earn in 2 years at the factory. It was enough to start a new life anywhere she wanted, enough to buy her freedom from the mess that Benjamin Fletcher had created. But as she looked at Morrison's cold smile, she remembered Caldwell's veiled threats and Tom Bradley's warning about bets being placed. This wasn't generosity, it was a purchase order. And what exactly would I be expected to do for this generous sum? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat like ice. Morrison's smile widened. Nothing too difficult. Just play along with a few harmless games. Some of the gentlemen in Lincoln are curious about you, thanks to Benjamin's stories. They'd like to meet you, see what all the fuss was about. The meaning behind his words hit Amelia like a physical blow. These men weren't offering her help. They were offering to buy her like a piece of property, to pass her around among Fletcher's friends for their entertainment. I'm afraid I must decline your generous offer, Amelia said, her voice carrying across the yard like a bell. I'm quite content with my current situation. Morrison's expression darkened. Now, Miss Hartwell, let's be reasonable. A woman alone on the frontier, with no family, no resources. You really don't have much choice in the matter. She's not alone, Daniel said quietly, but his voice carried the promise of violence. And she does have a choice. Does she? Morrison turned his attention to Daniel, sizing him up like a rancher evaluating livestock. Tell me, McKinnon, how long do you think you can protect her? How long before the bank decides your loan payments aren't quite up to date? How long before accidents start happening to your cattle, your horses, your crops? The threats hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Amelia saw Daniel's hands clench into fists, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw as he fought to control his temper. You're threatening me on my own land, Daniel said, his voice deadly calm. I'm simply pointing out realities. Morrison replied with a shrug. The reality is that Miss Hartwell has attracted attention from some very powerful men, the kind of men who don't like to be disappointed. Amelia had heard enough. She stepped forward, placing herself between the two men before violence could erupt. Mr. Morrison, let me make something perfectly clear. I am not a toy for bored rich men to play with. I am not a prize to be won or lost in your gambling games. I am a woman who has chosen where she wants to be and who she wants to be with. Morrison's face flushed red with anger. You don't understand what you're refusing, girl. This is bigger than just you. There are debts to be paid, promises to be kept. Benjamin Fletcher owed money to some very unforgiving people before he died. They're looking to collect, one way or another. The revelation hit Amelia like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about cruel pranks anymore. There was real danger involved, the kind that could destroy everything she and Daniel had built together. What kind of debts? Daniel demanded. Morrison's smile returned, cold and calculating. The kind that transferred to his victims when he can't pay them himself. Fletcher told everyone that Miss Hartwell was his property, bought and paid for. Some folks took that literally. Amelia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She was being hunted not just by men who wanted to humiliate her, but by people who believed they owned her. That's impossible, she whispered. I never signed anything. I never agreed to anything except marriage. Try explaining that to men who don't care about legal technicalities, Morrison said. They have Fletcher's IOUs with your name on them. As far as they're concerned, you're collateral for his gambling debts. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Amelia realized that her simple desire for a new life had trapped her in something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "How much?" Daniel asked suddenly. Morrison looked surprised. "How much what?" "How much does Fletcher owe? What would it take to clear her name completely?" Morrison studied Daniel with new interest. "More than a struggling rancher could ever pay. We're talking about $2,000, McKinnon, plus interest." Daniel's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "I want to see the papers. I want to see exactly what Fletcher signed and what it says about Miss Hartwell." "That can be arranged," Morrison said slowly. "But it will cost you. Information isn't free, especially when it involves this much money." Amelia grabbed Daniel's arm. "No, I won't let you bankrupt yourself for me. There has to be another way." But even as she spoke, she could see the determination in Daniel's eyes. He had already made his choice, just as she had made hers. They would face this together, whatever the cost. The morning sun painted the kitchen in shades of gold and amber as Amelia stared at the papers spread across Daniel's wooden table like pieces of a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. Morrison had returned the previous evening with a leather satchel full of documents, each one more damning than the last. Benjamin Fletcher's signature appeared on gambling markers, loan agreements, and something that made Amelia's blood run cold. A document that claimed to transfer all rights and considerations regarding one Amelia Rose Hartwell to cover his mounting debts. "It's not legal," Daniel said for the third time, his finger tracing the forged signature at the bottom of the transfer document. "You never signed this. Fletcher can't sell something he doesn't own." Morrison, who had spent the night in Daniel's barn rather than ride back to Lincoln in the dark, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "Legal doesn't matter much to the kind of men Fletcher owed money to. They're not the type to take their disputes to court." Amelia picked up the document that bore her name, studying the handwriting that had sealed her fate. "This signature isn't mine. Look at the loops in the A. I never write it that way." "Fletcher was always good with a pen," Morrison admitted. "Could copy anyone's writing if he put his mind to it. But proving forgery would take months in court and cost more money than either of you have." Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight this." Morrison set down his coffee cup and pulled out his gold pocket watch. "Actually, there might be. But you're not going to like it." Amelia looked up from the papers, hope and fear warring in her chest. "What do you mean?" "The men Fletcher owed money to, they're not completely unreasonable. They're businessmen, after all. If someone were to pay them what they're owed, plus a reasonable interest fee, they might be willing to forget about Miss Hartwell entirely." "How much?" Daniel asked, though Amelia could see he already dreaded the answer. $3,000, Morrison said casually, as if he were discussing the price of cattle feed. "Paid in full within 30 days. The number hit the room like a thunderclap. $3,000 was more money than most people saw in their entire lives. It was enough to buy a dozen ranches the size of Daniel's, enough to set up a person for life. "That's impossible," Amelia whispered. "No one has that kind of money." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I do." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Daniel and Amelia stared at Morrison, understanding dawning slowly in their eyes. "What do you want in return?" Daniel asked, his voice flat with resignation. Morrison walked to the window and looked out at the ranch, the neat garden, the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle grazing in the distance. "This is good land, McKinnon. Water rights, fertile soil, close enough to the railroad to make shipping cattle profitable. I've been looking for a place to expand my operations." "You want me to sell you my ranch," Daniel said. "I want you to sell me your ranch for exactly $3,000, Morrison corrected, "which you will then use to pay off Fletcher's debts. Miss Hartwell goes free. You get enough money to start over somewhere else, and I get the land I've had my eye on for months." Amelia felt sick to her stomach. Morrison had orchestrated this entire situation, from Fletcher's cruel joke to the forged documents to the impossible debt. He had been planning to get Daniel's ranch all along, and she had been nothing more than a tool to make it happen. "You planned this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of it. Fletcher's joke, the fake papers, everything." Morrison turned back to face them, his expression calm and satisfied. Benjamin Fletcher was a fool who couldn't keep his mouth shut or his debts under control, but he was useful for identifying opportunities. Women desperate enough to travel across the country for a husband are usually desperate enough to do anything to avoid going back where they came from. The truth hit Amelia like a physical blow. She hadn't been the victim of one man's cruel prank. She had been the target of an elaborate scheme designed to strip Daniel of everything he owned. "How many others?" she asked. "How many other women have you done this to?" Morrison shrugged. "Enough to acquire several nice pieces of property over the years. It's amazing what people will sacrifice to save someone they care about." Daniel's face had gone white with rage, but his voice remained deadly calm. "Get off my land." "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Morrison said. "The men Fletcher owed money to will be here within the week. When they arrive, they'll either collect their $3,000 or they'll collect Miss Hartwell. Those are the only two options." Amelia stood up slowly, her legs shaking but her resolve steady. She had spent her entire life being pushed around by circumstances beyond her control: poverty, family obligations, social expectations. But this time was different. This time, she had something worth fighting for. "There's a third option," she said quietly. Both men turned to look at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "We expose you for what you are," Amelia continued, her confidence growing with each word. "We take these forged documents to the sheriff in Lincoln. We tell everyone who will listen about your scheme. We make sure that every newspaper in Nebraska Territory knows exactly how you've been stealing land from honest people." Morrison laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it now. Who's going to believe a mail-order bride and a failed rancher over one of the wealthiest men in the territory? Amelia picked up the transfer document and held it up to the light streaming through the window. "Someone who knows how to spot a forgery. Someone who can prove that Benjamin Fletcher never had the right to sign my name to anything." She had noticed something about the paper that Morrison had missed in his arrogance. The watermark was wrong. This type of official document hadn't been available until 6 months after the date on Fletcher's signature. It was a small detail, but it was enough to prove fraud. "You made a mistake," Amelia said, showing the watermark to Daniel. "And that mistake is going to bring your whole scheme crashing down." Morrison's face had gone pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Even if you could prove forgery, it won't help you. The men coming to collect Fletcher's debts don't care about legal technicalities. They'll take what they're owed one way or another." "Then we'll be ready for them," Daniel said, moving to stand beside Amelia. "Together." Morrison looked at them both. This woman who refused to be broken, and this man who refused to abandon her, and for the first time since arriving, he seemed uncertain of his victory. The battle for Amelia's freedom was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. The thunderstorm that broke over the ranch that night seemed to shake the very foundations of Daniel's cabin, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside Amelia's mind. She sat by the kitchen window, watching lightning split the sky while her fingers traced the edges of the forged documents that could destroy everything she had come to love. Daniel paced the small room like a caged wolf, his boots wearing a path in the wooden floor. Morrison had left hours ago, but his threats hung in the air like the smell of smoke after a fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees with a sound that reminded Amelia of wolves calling to their pack. "We could run," Daniel said suddenly, stopping his restless movement. "Take the horses and head west. California, maybe, or Oregon Territory. Start over where no one knows our names." Amelia looked up from the papers, her green eyes reflecting the lightning flashes. "Running away won't solve anything. Morrison will just find another victim, another way to steal what isn't his." She set the documents aside and stood up, moving to face him. "Besides, this ranch is your home. Your father built this place with his own hands. I won't be the reason you lose it. It's just land, Amelia. Wood and stone and dirt. You're worth more than all of it combined." The words hung between them like a bridge, waiting to be crossed. In all their weeks together, Daniel had never spoken so directly about his feelings. Amelia felt her heart skip like a stone across water, but she forced herself to stay focused on the immediate danger. It's not just land to you, and we both know it, she said gently. This place holds your memories, your father's legacy, your dreams for the future. I can't ask you to give that up for me. A particularly loud crack of thunder made them both jump, and in the flash of lightning that followed, Amelia saw something in Daniel's face that took her breath away. It wasn't just affection or even love. It was absolute certainty, the look of a man who had found something worth dying for. Amelia, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I need to tell you something about why I really asked you to stay that first day. She waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say would change everything between them. When I saw you sitting on that trunk, looking like your whole world had just collapsed, I saw myself 3 years ago. After Sarah died, after I lost the original ranch, I felt like I was drowning in my own life. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, struggling with words. But it wasn't just sympathy that made me help you. It was hope. Hope for what? Hope that maybe I wasn't meant to live my whole life alone. Hope that maybe there was someone in this world who could see past my failures and still think I was worth knowing. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. You've made me remember what it feels like to have something to protect, something to fight for. And I'll be damned if I let Morrison or anyone else take that away. Before Amelia could respond, the sound of horses approaching through the storm made them both freeze. Daniel grabbed his rifle from beside the door, while Amelia blew out the lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness, lit only by lightning flashes. Through the rain-streaked window, they could see 3 riders approaching the house. But these weren't Morrison's well-dressed companions. These men looked like trouble of a different kind entirely. Their clothes were rough, their horses were tired, and they rode with the casual confidence of people who were used to taking what they wanted. Fletcher's creditors, Daniel whispered. They're early. The leader of the group, a man with a scar running down the left side of his face, dismounted and approached the front door. His knock was more like a demand, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. McKinnon, the man called out. We know you're in there. Open up. We've got business to discuss. Daniel looked at Amelia, his jaw set with determination. Stay behind me. No matter what happens, stay behind me. He opened the door just wide enough to show his face and the barrel of his rifle. It's past midnight, and there's a storm raging. Whatever business you have can wait until morning. The scarred man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I'm afraid it can't wait, friend. We've come a long way to collect what's owed to us. The girl Fletcher promised us. We're here to take her back where she belongs. Miss Hartwell doesn't belong to anyone, Daniel replied steadily, and she's not going anywhere with you. That's not what the papers say. The man pulled out a document from inside his coat, though the rain was already soaking it. Benjamin Fletcher signed her over to cover his gambling debts. Legal and binding, witnessed by 3 men in Lincoln. Amelia stepped into view beside Daniel, her chin lifted defiantly despite the fear racing through her veins. Those papers are forgeries. Fletcher never owned me, and he had no right to sign my name to anything. The scarred man's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Pretty little thing, aren't you? I can see why Fletcher thought you'd be worth something. He turned his attention back to Daniel. Here's how this is going to work, McKinnon. You hand her over peacefully, and we'll be on our way. Nobody gets hurt, and you get to keep your little ranch. And if I refuse? The man's smile was all teeth and malice. Then we take her anyway, and you get a bullet for your trouble. Your choice. Lightning illuminated the scene, like a photograph frozen in time. 3 armed men facing down one rancher, and the woman he was determined to protect. The odds were impossible, but Amelia saw no fear in Daniel's stance, only the quiet resolve of a man who had chosen his ground and was prepared to defend it. I guess we have a problem then, Daniel said calmly, because she's not leaving with you, and I'm not backing down. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Amelia could feel the violence building in the air, like the electrical charge before lightning strikes. In a few seconds, everything she and Daniel had built together could be destroyed by gunfire and blood. But sometimes, she had learned, the most unexpected solutions come from the most desperate moments. The standoff stretched like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap at any moment. Rain drummed against the cabin roof while the three armed men waited for Daniel to step aside and let them take what they claimed was theirs. But instead of backing down, Amelia did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She laughed. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into full-throated laughter that rang out over the storm like church bells on Sunday morning. The scarred man took a step back, clearly confused by her reaction. "You find something funny about this girl?" he growled. Amelia wiped tears from her eyes, though whether they came from laughter or fear, she couldn't say. "I find it hilarious that three grown men rode through a thunderstorm to collect a debt that doesn't exist from a dead man who never owned anything worth taking." She pulled the forged documents from her pocket, holding them up so the lightning could illuminate the papers. "You want to see what Benjamin Fletcher really signed? Come closer and look at these documents. Look at the dates, the watermarks, the signatures that don't match." The scarred man squinted at the papers, his confidence wavering for the first time. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've been played for fools," Amelia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Morrison used you just like he used Fletcher, just like he tried to use me. Those IOUs you're carrying, they're worthless. Fletcher never had any legal claim to me, which means he couldn't sign me over to anyone." Daniel caught on to her strategy and stepped forward, his rifle still ready but his voice calm and reasonable. "Think about it. Why would Morrison send you to collect a debt he could have settled himself? He's got more money than all of us combined." The three men exchanged uncertain glances. The scarred man's partner, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up for the first time. "Jake, maybe we should hear them out. Something about this whole deal never felt right." "Shut up, Eddie," Jake snapped, but Amelia could see doubt creeping into his expression. "Morrison played you against us so he could swoop in and play the hero," Amelia pressed on. "He probably promised to buy these fake debts from you for a fraction of what they're supposedly worth, then use them to force Daniel to sell his ranch. It's a scheme he's been running for years." The third man, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "She's right about one thing, Jake. Morrison did offer to buy the papers from us. Said he'd pay 50 cents on the dollar if we couldn't collect from the girl." Jake's face darkened as understanding dawned. "That son of a—" he caught himself, looking at Amelia with grudging respect. "You're saying Morrison set this whole thing up?" "I'm saying Morrison has been using desperate people to steal land from honest farmers," Amelia replied, "and you're just the latest tools in his game." The rain was beginning to lighten, and in the distance, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. Jake lowered his gun and studied the documents more carefully, his scarred face twisting with anger as he began to see the inconsistencies Amelia had pointed out. "These signatures don't match," he said finally. "And look at this date. Fletcher was in jail that week for fighting in a saloon. I remember because I was there when they arrested him." Eddie stepped closer to examine the papers. "And this paper stock. I've seen it before. Morrison uses it for all his legal documents. But these are dated 6 months before he started buying this type." The truth was spreading among the three men like ripples in a pond. They had been used, manipulated by someone they thought they could trust. The anger in their faces was no longer directed at Daniel and Amelia, but at the man who had sent them on this fool's errand. "What do you want us to do about it?" Jake asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Amelia looked at Daniel, seeing the same thought in his eyes that was forming in her mind. "Help us prove what Morrison has been doing. Help us make sure he can't do it to anyone else." "Why should we help you?" Eddie asked suspiciously. "Because he's cheated you just as much as he's cheated us," Daniel replied. "And because there's probably a reward for information about his land schemes. The territorial government has been investigating suspicious property transfers for months." Jake holstered his gun and walked closer to the porch, out of the rain. "What kind of reward?" "Enough to make up for whatever Morrison promised to pay you," Amelia said, "plus the satisfaction of seeing him face justice for what he's done." The three men huddled together, talking in low voices while rain continued to fall around them. Amelia could hear fragments of their conversation, words like revenge and justice and that lying snake. Finally, Jake turned back to face them. "All right, we'll help you. But we want more than just money. We want Morrison to pay for making fools of us." "What did you have in mind?" Daniel asked. Jake's grin was sharp as a knife blade. "I think it's time Mr. Morrison learned what it feels like to be on the receiving end of one of his schemes." As the storm finally began to clear, Amelia felt a new kind of energy building inside her. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't just defending herself, she was fighting back. Morrison had underestimated her, just like everyone else in her life had done. But unlike all those other times, this time she wasn't facing the fight alone. She had Daniel beside her, and now she had 3 unexpected allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see Morrison brought down. The war for her freedom was about to become something much bigger, a battle that would determine whether justice could triumph over wealth and corruption in the wild territories of Nebraska. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach in Bitter Creek Station, Amelia Rose Hartwell felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The morning sun revealed the true scope of Morrison's deception as Amelia sat at Sheriff Watson's desk in Lincoln, surrounded by a mountain of evidence that grew larger with each passing hour. Jake, Eddie, and their silent partner Tom had proven to be a treasure trove of information about Morrison's illegal activities, their memories sharp with the anger of men who had been used and discarded. 19 properties, Sheriff Watson muttered, running his weathered finger down the list they had compiled. 19 families driven off their land by fake debts and forged papers. This Morrison fellow has been busy. Amelia studied the faces in the old photographs Jake had brought, women who looked just like her, desperate and hopeful, standing beside men who thought they were building new lives. Each photo told a story of dreams destroyed and lives shattered by Morrison's greed. "The Hendersons," Jake said, pointing to a photo of a young couple standing in front of a modest farmhouse. Morrison claimed their daughter Sarah owed gambling debts from when she lived in Denver. Used the same forged signature trick. They lost their farm rather than see her dragged off to work in one of his establishments. Daniel, who had been quiet since they arrived in town, suddenly slammed his fist on the desk. "Sarah Henderson. I knew her. She married my neighbor's son 2 years ago. Never gambled a day in her life. Wouldn't even play cards at church socials." Sheriff Watson looked up from his notes, his gray eyes sharp with interest. "You can testify to her character?" "I can testify to more than that," Daniel replied grimly. "I was at her wedding. The pastor who married them keeps detailed records. We can prove exactly where she was and what she was doing during the time Morrison claimed she was gambling in Denver." Amelia felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. Each piece of evidence they uncovered made Morrison's web of lies more obvious, but it also revealed the devastating scope of his crimes. Families had been destroyed, lives ruined. Also, one man could accumulate more wealth and power. "There's something else," Eddie said quietly, pulling a small leather journal from his coat pocket. "Morrison didn't just target mail-order brides. He had a whole network of people working for him. Forgers, fake witnesses, even a judge or two who looked the other way for the right price." Sheriff Watson's eyebrows shot up. "A judge?" "Judge Blackwood in Carter County." Tom spoke for the first time since entering the sheriff's office. His voice was hoarse, as if he didn't use it often. "Morrison owns him outright. Any case that goes before Blackwood's court, Morrison wins. Been that way for 3 years now." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about individual crimes. It was about corruption that reached into the very foundations of territorial law. Morrison hadn't just been stealing land. He had been buying the legal system itself. "We need more than accusations," Sheriff Watson said finally. "We need proof that will stand up in court. Real evidence, not just testimony from men who worked for him." Amelia stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling main street of Lincoln. People went about their daily business, unaware that their community had been poisoned by corruption. She thought about all the families who had suffered in silence, too ashamed or too frightened to speak up against a man with money and influence. "I have an idea," she said, turning back to face the room. "But it's dangerous, and it means I'll have to put myself at risk." Daniel was on his feet instantly. "Absolutely not. We're not using you as bait." "Listen to me," Amelia said, her voice calm but determined. Morrison thinks he's won. He thinks I'm trapped and desperate. What if we let him think that? What if I go to him and pretend to accept his offer? It's too dangerous, Daniel repeated. If something goes wrong, we'll all be there to make sure she's safe, Jake interrupted. But the lady has a point. Morrison's gotten away with this because he's careful. He doesn't leave evidence lying around. But if we can get him to admit what he's done, record his confession somehow. Sheriff Watson leaned back in his chair, considering the idea. It could work, but we'd need to be very careful about how we do it. One mistake, and Miss Hartwell could end up in real danger. Amelia felt the familiar fear trying to claw its way up her throat, but she pushed it down. She had spent too many years being afraid, letting other people make decisions for her. This time, she was going to take control of her own fate. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Jake pulled out a small device from his pocket, something Amelia had never seen before. It looked like a tiny metal box with wires attached. Edison's latest invention, he explained. A recording device. Small enough to hide under clothing, sensitive enough to pick up conversation from several feet away. Where did you get that? Sheriff Watson asked suspiciously. Let's just say Morrison isn't the only one with connections, Eddie replied with a slight smile. We've been planning our own kind of revenge for weeks now. We just needed the right opportunity. Amelia studied the device, marveling at the ingenuity of it. The idea that human voices could be captured and played back seemed like magic, but she had heard rumors of such inventions coming out of the eastern cities. How does it work? She asked. Jake demonstrated, speaking a few words into the device, then playing them back. Amelia's eyes widened as she heard his voice emerge from the small speaker, tinny but clearly recognizable. Morrison will never expect this, Tom said, showing more animation than he had all morning. He's too arrogant to think anyone would dare try to trap him. Daniel moved to stand beside Amelia, his face tight with worry. I don't like it. Too many things could go wrong. Everything we've done so far has been dangerous, Amelia pointed out. But running away won't solve anything. Morrison will just keep destroying lives until someone stops him. She looked around the room at the faces of the men who had become her unlikely allies. Jake, scarred and rough but fundamentally decent. Eddie, nervous but determined to see justice done. Tom, quiet but steadfast. Sheriff Watson, older and wiser, committed to upholding the law. And Daniel, whose love and protection had given her the strength to fight back. If we're going to do this, she said finally, we need to do it right. Morrison can't suspect anything. I'll have to convince him that I'm truly desperate, that I'm ready to accept whatever terms he offers. What if he tries to force you to sign something? Daniel asked. Then I'll sign it, Amelia replied. A signature obtained under duress isn't legally binding, especially when we have proof of coercion. Sheriff Watson nodded approvingly. The lady knows her law. Very well, Miss Hartwell. If you're determined to do this, we'll support you. But I want backup plans for everything. If Morrison gets suspicious, if he tries to hurt you, if anything goes wrong at all, we abort the mission immediately. Amelia felt a mixture of terror and excitement building in her chest. For the first time since arriving in Nebraska, she was taking charge of her own destiny. No more running, no more hiding, no more letting other people decide her fate. When do we do it? She asked. Jake consulted his pocket watch. Morrison usually takes lunch at the Grand Hotel around noon, private dining room, away from prying eyes. If you approached him there, asked to speak privately about reconsidering his generous offer, he'd probably jump at the chance. That gives us 2 hours to prepare, Sheriff Watson said. 2 hours to make sure everything is perfect. As the men began discussing details and backup plans, Amelia found herself thinking about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach at Bitter Creek Station just a few weeks ago. That woman had been afraid, desperate, willing to accept whatever scraps of kindness strangers might offer. The woman she had become was someone entirely different. She was still afraid. Only a fool wouldn't be afraid of what they were planning. But the fear no longer controlled her. Instead, it sharpened her focus, strengthened her resolve, reminded her of exactly what she was fighting for. She was fighting for Daniel's ranch, for the life they had begun to build together. She was fighting for all the families Morrison had destroyed, and all the ones he might destroy in the future. But most of all, she was fighting for the right to choose her own path, to be more than just a victim of other people's cruelty and greed. In 2 hours, she would walk into the lion's den, but she would not walk in alone, and she would not walk in helpless. She would walk in as a woman who had finally learned her own worth, and that knowledge would be the most powerful weapon she could carry. The Grand Hotel's private dining room smelled of expensive cigars and old money, its dark wood paneling and crystal chandeliers, designed to impress visitors with the wealth and power of those who could afford such luxury. Morrison sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, cutting into a perfectly prepared steak, as if he didn't have a care in the world. When Amelia was shown into the room by a nervous waiter, Morrison's face lit up with triumph. He stood and pulled out a chair for her with exaggerated gallantry, his smile wide and predatory. "Miss Hartwell, what a delightful surprise. I had hoped you might come to your senses, but I admit I didn't expect it quite so soon." He gestured for her to sit, then returned to his own chair. "I trust McKinnon didn't give you too much trouble about accepting my generous offer." Amelia smoothed her skirts, feeling the weight of the recording device hidden beneath her corset. The wire Jake had shown her how to position ran along her ribs, uncomfortable but invisible. She had practiced her story during the carriage ride to town, preparing herself to play the role of a desperate woman with no other options. "Mr. McKinnon was understanding," she said carefully. "He realizes that a man in his position can't afford to make enemies of powerful people, not when his ranch depends on the goodwill of the bank." Morrison's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "A practical man. I respect that. And you, my dear, are proving to be far more sensible than I initially gave you credit for." He poured wine into a crystal glass and pushed it across the table to her. "So tell me, what changed your mind?" Amelia lifted the glass but didn't drink, using the moment to steady her nerves. "I realized that fighting you would be pointless. You have money, influence, the law on your side. What do I have? Nothing but stubbornness and pride, and neither of those will keep me fed or sheltered." "Exactly." Morrison slammed his hand on the table with enthusiasm. "Finally, someone who understands how the world really works. The strong take what they want, and the weak learn to adapt, or they perish. It's nature's way." The casual cruelty in his voice made Amelia's skin crawl, but she forced herself to nod as if she agreed. "I've been weak long enough. If I'm going to survive in this territory, I need to be smart about choosing my allies." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man who was used to evaluating assets. "You know, you might actually be worth more than I originally thought. Most of the women who answer matrimonial advertisements are, how should I put this, delicately, lacking in refinement. But you have education, poise, the ability to think strategically. Those are valuable qualities in my line of work." Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of work are you referring to, Mr. Morrison?" "Land acquisition, primarily. The territory is growing, and smart men are positioning themselves to profit from that growth. Sometimes that requires creative solutions to legal obstacles." Morrison took a sip of his wine, watching her reaction carefully. "Women like you can be very helpful in persuading reluctant property owners to see reason." "You mean you've done this before?" Amelia asked, injecting just the right note of curiosity into her voice. "Used women to help you acquire land?" Morrison's chest puffed with pride. "My dear girl, I've been perfecting this system for over 5 years. Do you think Benjamin Fletcher was the first fool I've used to lure desperate women west? I have a network of men in a dozen cities, all placing matrimonial advertisements on my behalf." The admission hit Amelia like a physical blow, but she fought to keep her expression neutral. Morrison was confessing to a criminal conspiracy that stretched across multiple territories, ruining countless lives for his personal gain. "That's very impressive," she managed. "How many properties have you acquired this way?" Morrison waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, dozens. The beauty of the system is that it's almost foolproof." Desperate women make desperate choices, and desperate men will sacrifice anything to protect someone they care about. McKinnon is just the latest in a long line of fools who thought they could play the hero. Amelia felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to lean forward with apparent interest. And the debts? The papers that claim these women owe money? All forged, of course, Morrison said with a laugh. I have an excellent forger on my payroll, a man with gambling debts of his own who does whatever I tell him to do. Fletcher was actually quite talented with a pen. It's a pity he had to die before I could make better use of his skills. The casual way he dismissed Fletcher's death chilled Amelia to the bone. This man felt no remorse, no guilt about the lives he had destroyed. He spoke about human suffering, as if it were nothing more than a business expense. What about judges? She asked, remembering what Tom had told them about Judge Blackwood. Surely the courts would eventually catch on to your schemes. Morrison's smile turned cold and calculating. The courts see what I want them to see. Judge Blackwood in Carter County has been very cooperative, and Judge Harrison in Douglas County has recently become much more amenable to my point of view. Amazing how quickly a man's perspective can change when you have evidence of his indiscretions. Blackmail. Amelia realized that Morrison's corruption went even deeper than they had suspected. He wasn't just forging documents, he was buying and coercing the very officials who were supposed to uphold justice. You seem to have thought of everything, she said, fighting to keep the disgust out of her voice. I have indeed. Which brings us to your situation. Morrison leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her face. I'm prepared to offer you a position in my organization. $500 immediately, plus a percentage of future acquisitions. All you have to do is help me convince other property owners to sell when I need their land. And if they refuse to sell? Amelia asked. Morrison shrugged. Then we find other ways to persuade them. Sometimes a woman's tears can be very convincing. Sometimes the threat of scandal or financial ruin works better. And sometimes, he didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Violence. Morrison was admitting to using violence against innocent people who stood in his way. Amelia felt the recording device warm against her skin, capturing every word of his confession. I see, she said quietly. And what guarantee do I have that you won't simply dispose of me when I'm no longer useful? Morrison laughed, apparently delighted by what he saw as her practical thinking. My dear girl, useful women are far too valuable to dispose of carelessly. As long as you remain loyal and effective, you'll have my protection and my support. Cross me, however. He left the threat unfinished, but his eyes held the promise of terrible consequences. Amelia nodded as if she understood and accepted his terms. Very well, Mr. Morrison, I accept your offer. When do we begin? Morrison raised his wineglass in a toast. Immediately. I have a property in mind. A small farm about 20 miles west of here. The owner is a widower with 2 young children. I'm sure a woman of your persuasive abilities could help him see the wisdom of accepting my generous offer. The thought of helping Morrison terrorize a man with children made Amelia feel physically ill, but she forced herself to smile and raise her own glass. 2 profitable partnerships, she said. 2 profitable partnerships indeed, Morrison echoed, draining his wine in one gulp. As they clinked glasses, Amelia thought about Sheriff Watson and Daniel waiting outside, about Jake and his partners ready to move at her signal. Morrison thought he had won, thought he had found another victim to add to his collection. Instead, he had just confessed to enough crimes to put him away for the rest of his life. The recording device had captured every word, every casual admission of fraud and corruption and violence. For the first time since this nightmare began, Amelia felt truly hopeful. Morrison's reign of terror was about to come to an end, and she had been the one to bring him down. But as she looked into his cold, calculating eyes, she realized that the most dangerous part of their plan was still ahead. Morrison was about to discover that his latest victim was actually his downfall, and men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. The real battle was just beginning.